Hi, welcome back to Cbse Board Economics. My name is Saddam Hussain. This is our third episode for Class 11 Economics. In the first episode, we covered the basic economic problem. In the second episode, we covered the central problems and we explained in detail the first central problem, what to produce and how much quantity. Let's refresh. I'll give a flashback. The first thing you learned, what is basic economic problem? The basic economic problem is problem of choice because of unlimited wants, unlimited resources which have alternative uses. So put it into points. The first point is human wants are unlimited. The second point is wants are unlimited, insatiable, I told you. And the second point is resources are limited or scarce. The third point is these limited resources have alternative uses. And the last one, we have to make a choice. This problem of choice is basic economic problem that we discussed in detail. Please go back to the first episode if you want further details or more understanding. The second topic we discussed was this basic economic problem leads to the central problems of the economy. Which are the central problems? There are three central problems: what to produce and how much quantity, how to produce and for whom to produce. The first central problem of what to produce and how much quantity we explained in detail. Now let's refresh, get a flashback. What to produce and how much quantity in 2-3 sentences. Since the economy cannot produce all the goods and services or the commodities it wants to produce, the economy has to decide what to produce and how much quantity of them. The economy has to decide whether to produce capital goods or consumer goods, whether to produce military goods or civilian goods, whether to produce luxury goods or necessities. And we summed it up in the second episode. The economy has to make a choice. That is, the guiding principle for the economy is to choose that combination of commodities which can satisfy maximum wants of the people. That's what we discussed so far. Now let's go to discuss the second central problem of the economy, that we call it as how to produce. How to produce basically deals with the techniques of production. What exactly you mean by techniques of production? Since we've been talking about limited resources and we discussed earlier, we have to economize these resources. That means we have to put the best use of these resources and we can't afford to throw them, we can't afford to waste them. So that's why the second central problem is how to produce. That is technique of production. That means without wastage of resources, we have to produce maximum number of goods at the cheapest cost possible. That is, the economy has to face this problem. Basically, for any economy, there are two techniques of production. One, we call it as labor-intensive technique of production. In this technique of production, the economy uses more labor and less capital. Capital means machines, infrastructure. And the second technique is capital-intensive technique of production. In this technique of production, the economy uses more capital, that is machines, and less labor. So let's come to this central problem with detailed study. The second central problem of an economy is how to produce. The economy has to choose between the two techniques of production. For any economy, there are two techniques available. One is labor-intensive technique of production. Under the labor-intensive technique of production, the economy uses more labor and less capital. Which economy uses this technique? This technique is mostly used in developing economies like India or even underdeveloped economies. Why do we choose labor-intensive technique of production? Because in these economies, plenty of labor is available and the labor is very cheap. Cheap labor is available, plenty of labor is available, but we can't afford big machines. That's why in Indian agriculture you see mostly they employ laborers because the laborers are very cheap, rather than going in for choppers or tractors or other harvesting machines. The farmers can't afford it. And the second technique is capital intensive technique of production. In this technique of production, we use more capital, more machines and less labor. This technique is mostly used in developed countries like USA, France, Japan, Germany. Because in these countries, labor is pretty expensive. The capital is cheap, they have machines. That's why everything is done with the help of machines. So we use less capital intensive technique of production in a country like India because we can't afford capital intensive technique. Labor is very cheap here. So now, how to decide which technique you use? Who will guide the economy? So the guiding principle for the economy is to choose that technique of production with which it can produce a commodity at the cheapest cost possible. The guiding principle for the economy is to choose that technique of production. You choose yourself whether you want to have labor intensive or capital intensive depending upon the cost of production, that technique of production with which you can produce a commodity at the cheap cost possible. So that's why we already concluded that the Indian economy chooses labor intensive technique of production because of availability of more cheap labor. So to take an example, if you can produce a pen using labor intensive technique of production for 9 rupees and capital intensive technique of production 10 rupees, obviously we go in for labor intensive technique. If the economy is producing billions and trillions of pens, the economy will be able to save a lot of money. So I repeat once again, we are discussing the second central problem. They can ask you, explain the central problem of how to produce. How to produce basically deals with the techniques of production. There are two techniques available to the economy. One is capital intensive technique of production. Number two is labor intensive technique of production. Number one, under capital intensive technique of production, we use more capital and less labor. This technique is mostly used in developed countries like USA, Japan, Germany, France. Because in these developed economies, labor is pretty expensive. So they go in for machines. The second technique is labor intensive technique of production. Under labor intensive technique of production, we use more labor and less capital. This technique is mostly used in developing countries like India and underdeveloped economies. Because here there is a plenty of cheap labor available. So the guiding principle for any economy is to choose that technique of production with which it can produce a commodity at the cheapest cost possible. So how to produce? It deals basically with the techniques of production, labor intensive and capital intensive production. Under labor intensive, more labor and less capital. Under capital intensive, we use more capital and less labor. This technique is mostly used in developing countries like India. This technique is mostly used in developed countries like USA. Here, why do they use it in countries like India? Because of plenty of availability of labor, that too cheap labor. This is used in developed countries because labor is pretty expensive. The guiding principle is to choose that technique of production with which you can produce a commodity at the least cost possible. I'm 100% sure you must have followed it. That's all we have time for this episode. Till we meet next time, it's goodbye from Saddam Hussein. Please don't forget to subscribe, share, like, and comment. It's goodbye. Best of luck.